How did the barber win the race? He knew a shortcut. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. That particular Friday at the office was grueling, and all I thought about was getting home to relax on the couch. I exited the highway, then turned off the county road into my neighborhood, a street lined with homes full of families and retirees, ending in a cul-de-sac. As I drove onto my street, I rolled down my car window to wave to the local children riding bikes and shooting a basketball in the cul-de-sac, and to the couples walking their dogs in the balmy weather. I parked in my driveway, fetched the newspaper, and just took a moment to enjoy the scene. Children laughing and undoubtedly excited about the approaching conclusion of the school year. My elderly next-door neighbor, Mr. Eugene, watering the crepe myrtle that overlooked his exterior cellar doors and manicured flower bed. Squirrels foraging in the widow's pine straw-laden yard across the street. Pop music blasting from the radio of a young woman cleaning her vehicle. Focused runners of all ages passing up and down my road, intermittently glancing at their Fitbits. Little Jack, as most of us called him, berating some older kids over rules of an imaginary game. Loving husbands and wives pulling into their respective driveways, eager for the weekend. It was a convivial neighborhood. It was a neighborhood I was proud to call home. Being single, I'd learned to cook for myself, and with nothing on my to-do list, I took the time that evening to prepare a delicious meal of chicken parmesan with zucchini and a baked potato. When there was an opportunity to do something, I took it. Since cutting cable, I'd rekindled my love of reading, and my bowing bookshelves were proof. I had decided to spend that afternoon reading. As the final rays of the sun inked out the details of the distant trees, I leaned on my dining room table for another forkful and leafed through the local newspaper articles. High school graduation dates, op-eds over teacher pay, and analysis over college sports from the sports editor. Then, on page 5, something caught my attention. Statistics this year, I read aloud to myself. For missing persons is an outlier, as the newest reports for missing women bring the total to 7, an unprecedented number in the area. I set the paper down and stirred my leftover noodles drenched in red sauce, knowing those women deserved better. I couldn't believe it was on page 5. Something so traumatic for the families of the missing, including those in the community, should get more attention, more publicity, so those poor helpless women could be found, not sequestered in a trivial corner of page 5. Those women had families. Those women had friends. Those women were loved. 7. My God, I repeated in horror. Then my dining room was painted in the blue, strobing back and forth in waves of color and exigency. My bay windows gave me a good view of the scene unfolding outside Mr. Eugene's house, a pair of patrol cars with rolling blue lights, officers hesitantly waiting outside, an ambulance being stuffed with a loaded gurney. I joined a few other nosy neighbors on the sidewalk and approached the busy lawn, which was still wet from my neighbor watering his plants. One of the female officers approached the small fretful crowd. "Ma'am, what happened?" a crowd member asked. "We think maybe a heart attack, but we aren't sure." "Is Mr. Eugene dead?" someone asked flatly. "Heavens no. He's been a chatterbox since we got here. He made the emergency call himself. They're taking him to the hospital for tests, but hopefully, he'll be okay." The crowd became less tense. "But there is one thing," the officer added. He kept going on about his bird. Feeding it. Watering it. Birdcage maintenance. He was adamant about finding someone to take it in for a few days until he gets back from the hospital. "So, is anyone interested?" All responses were answered in the negative. "I can't, I have 2 cats. My dog would chase it around the house. I'm not stinking up my house with a bird. No thanks. I don't know the first thing about pet birds. Knowing the old man had no children nor immediate family, I expected the bird would be taken to a humane society which would crush Mr. Eugene's spirits and chances of a full recovery. All the neighbors wanted him back to his healthy gregarious self, including me. I had no other pets and plenty of free time. When there was an opportunity to do something, I took it, so I raised my hand above the crowd. I'll do it. Because I turned on every light, including the lamps. Its grey plumage and layers of alternating white edges along the body gave the African grey parrot a mystical, almost ghost-like appearance against the white painted walls of my living room. I watched it hop along with the arched perch inside the bird cage that some officers and I removed from Mr. Eugene's vacant house, along with bird toys and a container of food. I was unaware of any name, so I called it Stormy. It was a name I picked due to its murky color and unfortunate reason for being in my company, and since it would be with me for several days, I felt it was my right to call it what I wanted. I watched Stormy preen, dropping its head into the blanket of feathers, then stroking its bill between the layers before shaking several feathers loose. I watched with an intense fascination. Stormy reciprocated with twitching of its head and flashes of those pale amber eyes at me, one at a time. I lounged on the couch and read some, occasionally looking up past the prose to inspect the parrot bobbing his head and listing back and forth for attention. I obliged by postponing my book and stroking my new pet along its head and back, then went to bed early. It must have been near sunrise when I heard the man inside my home. The unfamiliar voice woke me in an instant, and I sprang from my bed directly into my closet, where I fetched my revolver. With my eyes well adjusted from the darkness of sleep, I followed the white outlines of the hallway walls, stepping past the basement door and guest bedroom, gliding my hand along the walls, being careful not to accidentally slide any frames off their nails, then staggered cautiously toward the strange voice. I listened for footsteps or breathing or any sign that the intruder was approaching, but all was quiet. Until the voice boomed loudly from the living room. Breakfast time, breakfast time. I studied the dark room for movement, but it only came from the pale flutterings inside the cage. The same phrase boomed again when I switched on a lamp. Stormy hopped, mirthful and excited, along with the porch and called out the phrase again. I set the revolver on the table and let out a chuckle at the situation. I had completely forgotten that birds, especially the African grey parrot, could mimic human voices. Stormy called out the phrase again. The clock read 5:30, and I deduced that Mr. Eugene, in his slack and post-retirement routine, awoke and fed his bird in the early morning each day, and since the old man had not been around, the bird took it upon itself to demand its routine not be interrupted. I filled the bracketed cup inside the cage with fruit pellets and left Stormy to eat while I got ready. As I walked back down the hallway, I heard my new friend squawk another phrase, but I couldn't make it out. It was either "Can you see me?" or "Can you help me?" After enjoying my coffee and the company of Stormy, I left my home to complete the day's errands. I shopped around in the mall for several hours looking for a potential birthday gift for my mother. Because of my relative closeness to the furniture store, I browsed the couches, but nothing appealed to my taste. I enjoyed a light lunch of a club sandwich and chips at a deli downtown, then made a stop at the grocery store to purchase all the necessary ingredients for my meal prep plan that week. It was almost 3 o'clock by the time I returned home. Burdened by a slew of stuffed plastic sacks looped around each arm, I lumbered past my foyer and into my kitchen, where I began arranging the groceries in their proper places. In the focus of my task, The high-pitched elocution of Stormy's greeting went unnoticed at first until the verbal bird enunciated again. "Help me, please. Help me please." "What's wrong?" I called half-heartedly. "You still hungry?" "Help me please, call the police, missing Jada, missing Jada." I stopped organizing my canned vegetables. My worry of what order the boxes of pasta best fit into the cabinet melted away. The thoughts of my future supper vanished. My short-stay guest had my full attention. Although without the proper cadence and rhythm of a human, Stormy was clearly mimicking the statements of a female. Stormy called out again. "This is Jada and Amanda. God help police, God, we're prisoners." I approached the grey bird in a somber manner as those phrases and words, although sometimes jumbled incoherently, were spouting from its speak. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The pleas of assistance and mercy from a woman being transmitted and filtered through a veiled conveyances right into my living room. Much like itself, that bird, perched inside its thin metal prison, bore the remarks of someone trapped, alone, scared. Birds only repeat what they have heard, but could it be believed? Could Mr. Eugene have imprisoned those missing women and their cries had become stored into his pet bird? Stormy repeated the phrases again and an evocation ripped through me like lightning. I ran to my dining room table and scattered the pile of newspapers out in the desperate hopes that my memory was inaccurate. I was proved wrong. I scanned the lines of text in the article I'd read the previous day, about the missing women, and found the names of the two latest victims, Jada and Amanda. That night I remained restless. I laid in my bed for an hour before discerning my night would be one without rest. The bird mimicked what it heard and repeating it to me before Mr. Eugene reclaimed his pet was a stroke of luck. Mr. Eugene, the Carmelie neighbor who actually held women against their will. Mr. Eugene, the sick psychopath who fooled the neighborhood, including me. Thanks to Stormy, I knew I had an opportunity to show the neighborhood a serial killer lived amongst them and he would be tried for his crimes. When there was an opportunity to do something, I took it. The crimson wash of the sunrise overwhelmed the neighborhood and the light poured like streams of wine out of the spaces between the distant oaks. I watched the sunrise, weary and panting, until the officers arrived. I was sitting on the steps of Mr. Eugene's porch when I beckoned them to what I'd found. They passed by and entered the exterior cellar doors that were covered in ominous shadows from the overhead crepe myrtle. Even over the whine of my sobbing, I could hear them curse and vomit at the scene underground, the stench, the blood, the 7 bodies. The proof. After the initial shock and arrival of other officers in droves into the streets, blocking some residents from exiting their driveways, the female officer from 2 days earlier pulled me aside to question me away from the ballooning crowd. I explained the credit should be given to Stormy, the hero bird who gave up his master for the betterment of mankind and justice. I explained how after hearing the bird repeat the cries of distressed women I suspected Mr. Eugene's involvement in the missing women's cases. I explained how the names the bird called out matched those in the newspaper. I told her that throughout the night I broke into my neighbor's home using an expired credit card and searched for any signs of them but found nothing until I spotted the door to his cellar. Using a pair of bolt cutters I entered the underground chamber, despite my knowing that it was illegal to do so. I told the officer that my hopes of finding the women alive were my reasoning for doing this illegal activity without calling the authorities first. I wanted to save them as quickly as possible. I was too late. To my surprise, the officer admonished me. She explained that a citizen breaking and entering on grounds from the advice of a parrot has the potential to ruin any legal case against Mr. Eugene and his murdering rampage. She spits after saying his name. She cursed him, then cursed me for not calling authorities immediately. "It could be my fault he gets off," she said. I hung my head in shame and sobbed harder. After the initial shock of the matter wore off and the realization of how cruel her reprimand sounded, she lifted my chin. "Sir, we need to get his son of a bitch, and we will. Imprisoning, raping, murdering these women only to be found innocent over some technicality? Hell no. After what I've seen, even with your irresponsible behavior, Mr. Eugene will not be let off by a jury. This son of a bitch will pay for what he's done." Before I returned to my house, the officer rescinded her earlier remarks and apologized, then commended my valorous effort, even though I muddied up the overall case. But she reassured me with the overwhelming evidence of 7 bodies, some victims heavily decomposed, others bruised with ligature marks on the wrists and ankles. A guilty verdict was definite. 2 victims, she said, were recently murdered and mutilated. She presupposed Mr. Eugene killed them like the others, and maybe the work of the dismemberment was too much for his heart to handle. I wiped my eyes and agreed to make a testimonial statement the following day at the department, then shuffled down the sidewalk. Once inside my house, I cleaned my face and arms, then made a cup of coffee and fixed some toast. Stormy watched, placid and friendly, as I took my breakfast down the hall and into the basement where, once the door was open, the smell was still apparent. Down the steps, I went crunching on my toast until arriving at the dirt floor. The shackles nailed into the walls and support beams still had dried blood on them, and the dirt from freshly dug graves still smelled ripe of decay and rot. I bit my toast and sipped my coffee, wondering how much bleach and light would take to rid my basement of the smell, or if a layer of concrete would be the best option. I swigged the dregs of my coffee, now room temperature and no longer masking the odor of the lower level, and wondered how I could dispose of the wheelbarrow I used to transport the Lucky 7 from my house to Mr. Eugene's cellar. Could I find a dumpster in town, maybe behind a factory or large retail store, where it would get overlooked with the other assorted profusions? Perhaps I could clean it up nicely and sell it at the next neighborhood garage sale. My muscles ached and my back was tension-strained from all the work the night before, so I rested on an old crate near a wall. A drop of water hit my foot from above and I noticed a small vent protruding slightly from the wall about 6 feet above me, and from it came a noise. I stood atop the crate and listened. It was Stormy. The message was garbled at first, but the closer my ear drew to the vent, the clearer it became. Breakfast time. Breakfast time. My act of talking into the vent stopped my new pet's demands. It was proof of how my prisoner got a message out into my living room. Obviously believing the calling and outlandish statements of Stormy were from a human, a possible savior. Once I returned to the living room and the hungry comportment of Stormy was clear, along with the squawking and repetition of the phrase, I filled his cup with fruit pellets, then washed my coffee cup in the sink. Outside, between the slats of window blinds, the sun had arrived above the treetops and washed the neighborhood in light. Police was still scurrying around the area, telling my neighbors to return to their homes and waving media away until more information was released. It was a convivial neighborhood. It was a neighborhood I was proud to call home. But I knew my neighbors would be tentative from now on, as they should be. They had all befriended a serial killing who appeared cordial and hospitable in the neighborhood, only to torture and kill helpless beloved women in his spare time. I skimmed the newspapers strewn across my table once more, feasting on the joy of each name and description, before tossing them in the wastebasket. 7. My God, I repeated in horror. It only seems like yesterday when I brought the first one back. Time does fly, doesn't it, Stormy? Poor innocent Mr. Eugene. The man who would be arrested while still in a hospital bed and would undoubtedly spend the last years of his life in prison, or at least, in court. Poor innocent Mr. Eugene. The man with a pet that heard my prisoner's calls from the basement, which upon screeching out its understandings gave me the opportunity to attribute my neighbor to the killings that I thoroughly enjoyed committing. When there was an opportunity to do something, I took it.